Welcome one and all, both physically and virtually present, to our final session of papers for the day. We'll be hearing two papers once again, and first of all, I am delighted to welcome John Young from the University of Strathclyde, who will be talking to us about the Privy Council, the Covenanters and military intervention in Ireland in the 1640s. There is no PowerPoint presentation for this one either, so don't feel that you're missing out on an absent PowerPoint presentation.
Okay, thank you very much for your introduction, Alan. I'd like to say it's a great pleasure for me to be involved in something where I've got two former students, Graham and Gillian in Michigan. Nice to see them doing well. So today I'm talking about the Privy Council, the Covenanters, and military intervention in Ireland, 1642 to 43. Now, obviously this is out with the chronology of the Privy Council project. So one of the things I'd also like to do is to maybe introduce or throw around some ideas with regards to methodology from the 1640s and how you think they could be adapted to the project. You know, and as Graham, I think quite rightly, was hinting at in his presentation, you know, that the Privy Council did draw on precedents from the 1640s, and the Privy Council in 1689 to 90 had to deal with the Irish situation, the war in Ireland, in a way that in the 1640s the Privy Council was dealing with military intervention in Ireland and its aftermath. So, you know, if you were studying Irish history, or more perhaps Ulster history, you know, there's a kind of comparative dimension you'd be looking at there. So obviously for several of us in the room, we're involved in the International Commission for the Study of Parliaments and Representative Assemblies. And from being involved in that over the years, some of the methodological approaches that scholars there have employed, I think, are particularly useful. Well, I found them useful for my own work. So firstly, the kind of the concept of the study of the history of political institutions. That's quite a big thing in continental Europe. So for us, the history of the Scottish Parliament as a political institution, the history of the Scottish Privy Council as a political institution fits into that framework. A second thing that I found really quite interesting, that I've increasingly tried to deploy in my own work and research, is this terminology or use of the term political actor. Right, so that doesn't mean like James Bond or anything like that, but a political protagonist. I have to explain that to undergraduate students, they're all excited. So that means like protagonists, participants. So putting these two things together, political actors and representative assemblies. So Privy Councillors as political actors in the representative assembly of the Scottish Privy Council. Something I think is also quite interesting, and be interested to see what you think about this. Non-Privy Councillors who were political actors but in other institutions. So non-Privy Councillors who are mentioned in Privy Council business or Privy Council decision making or warrants or whatever, who could be or who were in fact parliamentarians, members of the Scottish Parliament who are mentioned in the Privy Council, but they're not Privy Councillors. That could also apply to political actors who were lay elders in the Church of Scotland, who are mentioned in the Privy Council, records but are not Privy Councillors. And we can take that one stage further, I think. Political actors who were parliamentarians and who were also lay elders and who were mentioned in the Privy Council but were not Privy Councillors. So someone who's a parliamentarian but also a lay elder in the Church of Scotland, do they pop up in the Privy Council records? For me, for the 1640s, they do. But does that same scenario apply with regard to the Revolution? And does that same scenario apply to post-1692 Privy Council? So that's something out there for perhaps you to think about. And obviously, when we're dealing with the 1640s, we're talking about the Covenanting regime, we're talking about the Covenanting movement. So perhaps a related approach then is the Covenanting movement and its involvement and control of representative assemblies, such as Parliament, Privy Council, Church of Scotland, and political actors, covenanting political actors in Parliament, covenanting political actors in the Church of Scotland, and covenanting political actors in the Privy Council. So things like, obviously, Parliament, the structure of Parliament during the Covenanting period, the role of committees, parliamentary session committees and parliamentary interval committees. You know, Graham mentioned the Committee of the States from 1689, obviously drawing on the Covenanting precedent of 1640 to 41, but in a different way. It's not exactly the same. You have Parliament and its committees, we have the Privy Council, and we have the structure of the Church of Scotland. So the kind of interaction institutionally between Parliament, the Privy Council, and particularly the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, and particularly the Commission of the Kirk from 1642 onwards. Political actors in the Commission of the Kirk who are lay elders, who are also parliamentarians, and how they move between like the church and the state. So they're involved in state activities, but they're involved in church activities. Who are these people and what do we know about them? And I think prosopographical approaches for that, personally, I think are quite interesting. So does that happen? Does that also happen for, you know, the period of your project? You know, when you have the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland meeting after 1690, how many of the lay elders there were parliamentarians? How many of the lay elders there were Privy Councillors? What do you think about that? So I might say that's something broad, or that's to do with Scotland's national institutions. And just on a slightly different issue, that's something I've been picking up on and working on, particularly with regard to Parliament, would also apply to the Privy Council, I think. Lawyers as parliamentarians. Parliamentarians who were lawyers, Privy Councillors who were lawyers, the role of the law. You know, key examples are obviously the Dalrymple family and its network in the Union Parliament, for example. I think Adam Coburn of Ormiston for the Revolution period, I think he's a lawyer, I'm sure he is. He's a parliamentarian, but he's also in a lay elder as well. So we've got a national picture. But we can also have a local or a regional picture. What's the interaction between Edinburgh and the localities? So when we think about the 1640s and the Covenanting movement having military commitments at home and in England, and in Ireland, and in continental Europe, how does that impact on particular areas? So obviously, one of the big themes here for what I'm looking at is how did the Covenanting movement respond to the 1641 Ulster Rebellion or the 1641 Irish Rebellion? So that is obviously a massive issue in Irish history. So there is an interest in the Scottish dimension to that. So did the Scottish Parliament, after the 1641 rebellion, did it have an Irish policy? Did it have an Ulster policy? The answer to that is yes. So who were the key political actors and who were the key parliamentarians, and what was the parliamentary structure for the articulation of an Irish policy? Did the Privy Council thereafter have an Irish policy? What issues did it deal with? What actions did it undertake, etc.? So a lot of that is to do with the nuts and bolts or the minutiae of responding to the outbreak of a very significant rebellion in Ireland. And remember, by 1641, there are possibly up to 30,000 Scots in the island of Ireland, concentrated, but not exclusively in County Antrim and County Down. So you have issues of strategic security, you have issues particularly of maritime security. So how does a government, how does the Parliament, and thereafter the Privy Council in 1641, 42, 43, how does it articulate a policy and try to enact policies that primarily to do with the west of Scotland and the southwest of Scotland? You know, the relationship between Edinburgh and the localities. In turn, how does that relate to the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland? Because it says things about Ireland in the 1640s, mostly to do with ministers, but not exclusively to do with ministers. So in some respects, you could argue there's a kind of triangulation going on between Parliament, which closes on the 17th November 1641. Charles was in Edinburgh when the rebellion broke out. He goes back to London. Parliament ends in November 1641. We've got a new Privy Council that meets after then, but we also have the parliamentary interval committees that meet after the end of the 1641 Parliament. So how do the Parliament and its committees and then the Privy Council, how do they all relate to each other? Now, of course, what we do know is that the decision to intervene in Ireland was eventually taken after a kind of protracted diplomatic process, and we know that 11,000 troops, a Covenanting army of 11,000 was eventually sent to Ireland and was there to around about 1648. So maybe have that methodological approach. And something else that I've been working on recently, that, to be honest, I kind of stumbled into by accident, because one of my new colleagues at Strathclyde is an expert on piracy and put a big conference on piracy. So I kind of stumbled into that, had this idea, what was Parliament's response to piracy, the Scottish Parliament and the problem of piracy in the 1640s. And that's also related to Ireland, and it's also kind of related to France, because it's pirates from Dunkirk and Wexford. So Parliament, particularly around the Convention of the States 1643 and the 1644 parliamentary session, are saying they're saying things about the problem of piracy. They're setting up committees to deal with the problem of piracy. at the time when there's a Scottish Army in Ireland. So are some of the political actors involved in Parliament, are they mentioned in the Privy Council records, even though they're not Privy Councillors? And the answer to that is yes. And we can provide some examples of that. So the west of Scotland, the North Channel between Scotland and Ireland, strategic security, maritime security, and the problem of supplying a Scottish army in Ireland, which it can be described as an army in distress, are all interlinked. So things that we can look at with the Parliament and Privy Council, that kind of like interaction, although some of them are not sitting at the same time, things like committees, commissions, legislation, warrants, the identification of political actors, parliamentarians or Privy Councillors who were ship owners, etc. We could go down to the minutiae level. There is something that's quite interesting. Okay. Now, building again on this topic of political actors, and particularly one thing I found quite useful for the study of parliamentary history is the RPS website. And if you're thinking the Privy Council website is going to be modelled along those lines or whatever. So one of the things that I did a few years ago was a very, very detailed study of a Covenanter called Sir Robert Adair of Kenilk. And that was a very detailed article. It was published in America. It was really, where it was published was to do with the Scots-Irish communities in the Appalachians. So it was really for the Scots-Irish who were interested in Scottish and Ulster history. So the Adairs of Kenilk, Adair of Kenilk was a leading, what we may call, Ulster Scot. He had land in Ballymena. The family was originally from southwest Scotland. They had land in southwest Scotland. And Sir Robert Adair of Kenilk represented Wigtonshire in the 1639 to 41 Parliament and the parliamentary sessions of 1649 to 50. So using the search engine, in addition to putting his name in, words like Ulster, Ireland, Belfast, Coleraine, Carrickfergus, Dublin, let's see what comes up. So there, through quite a lot of hard work, managed to build up the most accurate profile I think was possible of Sir Robert Adair's role and activity as a parliamentarian. So for example, he was on the parliamentary committee for the commotion in Ireland. When news of the Irish Rebellion hit Edinburgh, Parliament sets up a committee, Sir Robert Adair of Kenilk's on it, as we would probably expect. He was a member of the Radical regime, or the Kirk Party regime, however you want to call it. He was appointed as a Privy Councillor in 1649, and he was clearly described in legislation from 1649 as a Three Kingdom person, someone active in the Three Kingdoms of Scotland, England and Ireland, a Three Kingdom protagonist and a Three Kingdom political actor. So quite a full profile there about a key political actor concerned with Ireland, who represented the Scottish parliamentary constituency. There are things about committees in Parliament, warrants in Parliament, and legislation in Parliament, and the Convention of the States. So, for example, in the 1643 Convention of the States, a committee was set up for furnishing the army in Ireland, for supplying the army in Ireland. One of the members of that committee was the representative for the Borough of Ayr, Hugh Kennedy. Okay, so remember that name. Hugh Kennedy represented the Borough of Ayr in the 1643 convention, and further individual in the 1643 convention who received a commission for equipping 2 ships, really to deal with piracy, largely coming from Wexford, was an individual named John Kennedy. So we have Hugh Kennedy and John Kennedy, and they were brothers, right? So their father was Hugh Kennedy, who had sat in the 1621 Parliament. Hugh Kennedy also went on to be quite an important, I would say, Covenanting borough member in Parliament. He too was a member of the radical regime. And the Kennedy brothers, in terms of a regional context, but as individual committed Covenanters within the movement, were very closely involved in the Irish policy, or in supporting the Ireland in army, the army in Ireland. So in 1644, Hugh Kennedy was paid £1,135 Scots to hire ships to carry meal to Ireland. Also in 1644, the Kennedy brothers were to be paid £1,137 Scots for further supplies. So these are businessmen in Ayr. They're ideologically committed Covenanters, who, as businessmen, are involved in supplying the army in Ireland and indeed in the shipping business. So whether we kind of regard them as Covenanting entrepreneurs. And diverting just a little bit, but I'll say it and then I'll move on. If we think about Ayrshire as an important region of Scotland, and Ayrshire as the Covenanting movement, part of the Covenanting movement, the ports and the boroughs of Ayr and Irvine are really important. So Hugh Kennedy represented Ayr, then later on John Kennedy did, his brother. The person who represented Irvine was Robert Barclay. And those individuals are very close to the Marquis of Argyll. You know, so they're part of Argyll's faction or Argyll's group. And that's really not very surprising given the geographic aspect to that. Okay, so the Privy Council then, 1642 to 43, what's it doing? What's most of its business about? One is about diplomacy, the diplomatic process that results in a Covenanting army being sent to Ireland. And then in 1643, the diplomatic process that comes to involve the Convention of the States and the Church of Scotland for Covenanting military intervention in the English Civil War. But a lot of its nuts and bolts business is preparing the invasion, preparing Covenanting military intervention in Ireland. So there's a lot of what we might call minutiae, or, as I said, nuts and bolts information, which I think is really quite important. And a second key thing that it's dealing with is humanitarian aid. So in the aftermath of the 1641 rebellion, the Scots come home. So Scottish settlers in Ulster start flooding in back to Scotland. So there's a problem of these distressed Christians, our own people, our own countrymen, our own countrywomen, as they're described, back in Scottish soil, and they have to be provided with humanitarian aid. So money's to be raised for them for distribution. Produce the paperwork to prove this is what happened to you, and you'll be helped out financially. And that leads into like something that's not so much in the Privy Council records, but it's there elsewhere, are the stories that people brought back. This is what happened to me. this is what happened to my husband. So a lot of the people we're talking about were women, were war widows from the 1641 Ulster Rebellion. And that's quite similar to what happens at the Revolution. And what's really interesting, because I do a lot of Ulster stuff, in some respects, there's more information about these issues for the Revolution than there is for the 1640s. So it gives you the, like in 1689, the name of the refugee ship off the Ayrshire coast. It's either at Ardrossan or Saltcoats. It's bringing people back from the siege of Derry, Londonderry. You know, it tells you the name of the ship. Actually, some of the stuff that tells you the name of the crew and the aid that's to be provided. Okay, so I mentioned Hugh Kennedy earlier. So on the 4th of May 1643, the Privy Council issued an order to pay Hugh Kennedy in Ayr for providing 2,000 pairs of shoes for the army in Ireland. Right. So Hugh Kennedy, remember earlier we mentioned, was supplying food with his brother. Here, this is official Privy Council records, supplied 2,000 pairs of shoes. Actually, it's really interesting, it tells you the shoe size. The Ayrshire folk must have had hell of a big feet by the way. 2,000 pair of good and sufficient double-soled shoes of 11, 12 or 13 inches. Who says micro isn't cool? Right, and Hugh Kennedy was to be paid or reimbursed at 24 shillings for a pair of shoes. Right, so there's Hugh Kennedy as a political actor supplying shoes for the army in Ireland, but he's not a Privy Councillor. But later on in 1643, he's in the Convention of Estates. So you see, we're moving between institutions. In 1649, he's a member of the Commission of the Kirk, if not before. 1650, he's a member of the Witchcraft Committee that's established. So it's the way we can look at people between and within institutions, you can build up a holistic picture of them. Hugh Kennedy, involved in the Irish campaign. Hugh Kennedy, involved in witch hunting. Hugh Kennedy was also a diplomat at the Treaty of Ripon, and some of the manuscripts, correspondence from the Swedish archives that Steve Murdoch passed on shows Hugh Kennedy and some other individuals involved in what we would call European diplomacy at Westminster. So I think that's kind of really interesting to build up a wider picture of Covenanters. So let's go clothing the army, Hugh Kennedy. The Privy Council and feeding the army. So on 7th of February 1642, the Privy Council issued a warrant for providing biscuit for the troops embarking for Ireland. So who got the warrant? Who got the deal? Who got told to go away and buy the biscuits or make the biscuits? It was George Porterfield. George Porterfield was a Burgess of Glasgow. He was to provide £3,000 weight of biscuit of white bread. He was also within the commission empowered to seize ammunition and other necessities for the army, if required, or if he could do so. And he was to provide safe conduct of those goods from Glasgow to Greenock, Ayr, or any other seaport where the regiments will rendezvous for embarking to Ireland. Now, Porterfield is an interesting character because, as I said earlier, he was aligned to Argyll in terms of local history. He brought the Gorbals into the city. Porterfield House was located on the High Street, now destroyed. He was also a witch hunter. He was also involved in purging the army in 1650. He was also a diplomat. He was also a lay elder in the Commission of the Kirk. And during the Restoration period, he was declared as a rebel and a traitor. He fled to the United Provinces, where he died. He was buried in the French church at Rotterdam, which I understand was bombed by the Germans during the Second World War. Okay, so it's getting down to the minutiae of Covenanters and involved in certain things. And the Privy Council providing quite a lot of that really interesting level of information minutiae. If we think about money or cash, the army in Ireland was an army in distress. It needed financial support. So a call went out for voluntary contributions, for people to put their hands in their pocket to supply that, to help fund the army in Ireland. So the Privy Council records have the financial accounts of the voluntary contributions, or people who supplied money. An analysis of financial accounts for 1643 indicates that voluntary contributions actually came from quite a wide social spectrum and were not restricted to the ruling elites. So here's some examples. In Edinburgh, money was given by a hat maker called James Wright, a fishmonger called Nicol Ewan, and 11 of the 94 contributions, which is about 12%, listed in the Edinburgh accounts, were from women, 10 of whom were widows. You know, so the role of women in covenanting is important. But here we have like 10 Edinburgh widows who were providing financial aid to support the army in Ireland. You know, that's that ideological commitment. Yeah, I don't know, 2 minutes, you can do that. Right. Now what's also interesting, as I mentioned earlier, the Privy Council was really having to deal with this humanitarian aid problem. I think by about June 1642, it's estimated, this is from the records, that there were 4,000 people from Ireland in the presbytery there in Irvine, and they couldn't cope. So a humanitarian aid structure was set up in 1642 for collecting money to be distributed, well, for collecting money and to distribute money. So if we're thinking of, you know, social history, return migration, the displacement of people, there's the structure, but quite often the stories and the real human experiences of what happened to people, which might not go down too well in some parts of Scotland in the 21st century, tells of the horrific experiences that they went through in Ulster, and they're in the church records. You know, so Kirk Session records, you know, I've obviously published this, but there's a lot more to be done. Some of these people end up as far north as Elgin, you know, and they're receiving help, they're receiving aid. So there's a very strong social dimension to this. And one thing that's quite interesting is I think that model was replicated in 1689, when you've got, again, return migration from Ireland to Scotland, but this time it's different because it's people who've lost their husbands in the Williamite War, but it's also the wealthy ship owners, the Scots who ran Belfast, the Scots who ran Derry, the Scots who ran Coleraine. They're there in Edinburgh at the Convention of the States saying, give us support, give us cash, let us raise troops, and let us go back and take these Jacobites on. So hopefully you found that quite interesting, some of the research questions I've raised, and also, you know, some specific issues about the Privy Council and the Irish issues and how they may relate to the later period that you're looking at just at the start date. And on that note, I'll finish. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. We will move straight on to our next speaker, who is our only remote speaker today. I will leave the technical side to Claire.
Gillian's message and asked me to change her title. Okay. Gillian, you might want to unmute yourself.
Oh! I think we can hear you, thanks very much. Our next and final speaker of the day is Gillian McDonald from Central Michigan University, and she will be speaking on protecting the post, the Privy Council and the post, I think it's called now.
Well, yeah, it was called that, and then I changed the title slightly. So weird being able to hear myself.
On you go.
All right, I mean, I probably can skip past the first slide at the moment. Okay, so the postal office that we know and recognise and pop down to in this era is a product of the Restoration era. So postal networks themselves are even older, and letters travel along trade routes or they're sent by royal courier. What this paper does is it uses the postal system as a communications lens to view the revolution of 1688 to 90 in Scotland. And this recognises Scotland's unique position in conversation with the other kingdoms. So the postal service is a product of disruptive and technologically driven processes, and the main change over time, surprisingly, is not speed. And given shipping delays right now, this is kind of apt, but it's quantity and regularity. The transformation of the possibilities in the early modern era for communication, specifically a result of the print revolution and the professionalisation of the postal service, create what we called a communications revolution, and this improved and expanded opportunities for contact and availability of information. Recent scholarship has recognised the importance of a regular and reliable postal system as crucial for the history of news, the development of news networks, and this goes in an indivisible tandem with the postal services on which they rely. The establishment of an ordinary postal system makes private correspondence easier, and it increases the flow of diplomatic information. And this is where this paper sort of intervenes. A persistent thorn in the side, if you will, for the burgeoning postal system are the governments of early modern states, since postal systems are originally a central node of state administration. So I think we can skip to the next slide. So in the British Isles, the so-called Glorious Revolution actually coincides with the expansion of the postal office and its redefinition for public rather than institutional use. By 1689, it's a national institution, and it even includes the independent London penny post. It's a national bureaucracy which runs from both London and Edinburgh, and the institution itself occupies an intermediary position between the society and state. One of the most important features of policy is maintaining secure and open lines of communication across the campaign. In Scotland, the post office is a vital mechanism for maintaining communication about national policy. So the Privy Council takes a nominal role in protecting those arenas of communication, and in Scotland this takes the form of protecting the postal system from interference and prosecuting individuals who dislodge the lines of communication between the central regime in Edinburgh and its strategic localities. You'll see this theme of strategic localities popping up from the 1640s all the way through to the 1690s. So recently, Rachel Vile has commented that postal employees in England became an arm of the state, and appointments to these positions within the postal service actually subject individuals to more scrutiny, especially in times of regime change. And this leaves the loyalty of those people in those positions in constant question. So during the Scottish Revolution, the Postal Service actually takes on a dual function. It both spies on its citizens and it connects the lines of communication across borders. Not surprisingly, the loyalty of its employees become a real concern. So John Blair makes a successful bid for the office in 1689 after the death of John Graham, who had held the office in 1674 under King Charles. John Wildman holds the corresponding office in London. So the postmaster in Scotland and in England keep regular correspondence along the London-Edinburgh route, and communication with Ireland is kept via packet post, but this doesn't come into fruition until after the Privy Council is nominated. The service to Ireland operates out of Portpatrick, and despite its remote location, it had a designated postal master who had specific functions and specific duties. So because of the public nature of the post, exchanging information runs with a risk. London's controlling share sheet of the postal system sees disputes over loyalty and the missing postal service. On more than one occasion, John Wildman comments on the broken seals of letters and missing packages, which have been intercepted, and advises the Secretary of State, George Melville, to address letters under a cover between the Postmaster Generals to avoid this problem. So the postmaster's position in England, like in Scotland, allows them to pass intelligence via different parliamentary institutions. In Scotland, this operates primarily through the Privy Council. So John Wildman not only opined about the waylaid post for Scotland around Durham and Newcastle, but also cautioned that broken seals and missing correspondence suggested that Jacobites had either seen or redistributed information in flying packets. He'd found 8 missing letters from the Scottish Mail, and by comparing the return from the postmaster at Edinburgh, from which he concluded that a postal worker had either been bribed or a bag had been broken open. And he warned that without secure lines of communication, there was no guarantee that the policy would remain coherent across the 3 kingdoms. Roger Whitley later accused Scottish postmasters of being more likely to raid mailbags as they had, quote, more to gain, end quote, from the activities. So the practice of opening mail is something that we see as a result from the Protectorate and Samuel Morland, who's the English Commonwealth official in charge of espionage. This practice actually continues even despite the King's objections well after 1688. In 1689, Samuel Morland believes that the only way to control the chaos of the 17th century is to open people's mail and find out what they're saying about the regime. Morland actually gives a statement to Charles Talbot, Duke of Shrewsbury, in which he discerns that all posts should be opened for the good of the country. Upon conversation and demonstration of opening and resealing letters, Morland reasoned that the practice should be implemented in all the kingdom's post offices. Quote, by these arts and by the frequent inspection of letters, when the practice is unsuspected, a king soon knows the temper of all his principal and active subjects throughout his dominions, end quote. Shrewsbury found this a little bit unnerving, and he and the king considered the practice an institution that ought to die, with Morland himself, fearing that it posed a more dangerous position of putting the regime into. However, the practice continues, and you can see it in use by the Privy Council in Scotland. Historian Stuart Oakley has also highlighted the importance of the interception of postal correspondence on the continent. Intercepted copies and decoded letters were also used to counter French diplomacy in Northern Europe in a post office in Northern Germany. So postmasters and packet boat operators actually operate in a really precarious position, since they could transport Jacobite correspondence and boat operators could facilitate espionage. So monitoring the post comes with its advantages and its drawbacks. And early in the campaign, the Privy Council's dealings with spies hardened their resolve on ferryboat and packet boat operators across the country, especially on the West Coast. For that reason, the Postmaster General is instructed to set up offices and hire, quote, loyal postal workers in strategic locations. Can you go to the next slide, Claire? Sorry. So this picture is actually from the Port Patrick. No, this is not, sorry. This is from the Postal Office Treasury records. And notable offices that were set up during John Blair's tenure are Edinburgh to Dundee, Edinburgh to Glasgow, Edinburgh to Ayr, Edinburgh to Irvine, Edinburgh to Port Patrick, Edinburgh to Aberdeen, Edinburgh to Berwick, and Edinburgh to Carlisle. And he actually creates contracts between all of these places. What you will notice is these are all places in strategic localities, and they're located relatively close to the coast. So the Postal Service employs several individuals, and working for the office offers quite a lot of advantages that go just past earning a salary. And this includes synergy with other occupations, including, as previously mentioned, packet boat operators who could take passengers along the mail routes. For men and women who ran or owned inns or alehouses, the post could also increase traffic to these areas, since people would come and collect their mail. Constant scrutiny left those in these positions always in question, and you can see various acts by the Privy Council about the loyalty and taking an oath of allegiance for these positions. So it does actually allow the Privy Council to weed out sympathisers in certain places, because they're well aware of the fundamental need for access to news and information. So these publicly accessible postal networks and the continuous flow of information creates a paradox: faster communication, but there is a risk of interception. So communication between central and local governments is essential to the success and the security of the regime. The Privy Council, together with the Scottish Parliament, seeks to control these lines of communications to allow for a cohesive strategy across the kingdoms. The mail becomes unusually important in the Scottish Revolution because it allows this coordination, and the very existence of spies and information networks only enhances this importance of the mail. So the Postmaster General becomes the primary mechanism for communication, and in the wrong hands, this could threaten the security of the regime. So to mitigate this problem, the Privy Council and the 1689 Convention nominate a committee for preventing postal interception, and in 1690 Parliament passes a similar act against the robbery of the post in the interest of public service and safety. Moreover, the postmaster is also empowered to, quote, secure the post boy until he give account how it come to be broken and by whom, end quote, if the post has a broken seal or has been tampered with in any way. The Postmaster General actually has the powers to go and investigate that situation. So those who were employed as letter office managers are also under scrutiny. Oh no, sorry, we're at the right slide, never mind. One incident in October 1689 shows how seriously the Privy Council perceived the disruption of postal networks. William Mine, who is the holder of the Edinburgh Letter Office, was accused of, quote, malverizations, end quote, in 1689. The truth of these charges is uncertain, but the actions of the council speak to the severity of the actions taken against the disruption of the postal system. So in this period, the recipient actually paid both postal and delivery charges. And if the addressee was absent, deceased, or unreachable, letters often remained in the office. So Mine found himself in a bit of hot water because during wartime, quote, keeping up letters, end quote, even for payment could be perceived as a disruption of communication. And having kept letters addressed to Ireland back in the Edinburgh office, because of a lack of payment, he breached wartime communication. And as a result, he got called before the council and sent to the toll booth for 2 days. And he was released on bond 2 days later, but the investigation actually went on for some time and involved counsel from John Wildman to assess the severity of the situation. It does appear that Mine kept his job, but he was called before the council a number of times for disrupting the communication system. Okay, next slide, please. So in other cases where the mail has gone missing or been physically stolen or discarded, the Privy Council calls an extraordinary session to deal with these specific thefts or intercepted communications. Because this happens relatively frequently and letters often arrive at their destinations with broken seals or sometimes never arrive in general, it creates a little bit of suspicion. And since Scotland has very few printing presses and the networks of their communication are smaller than in England, you can see the international post lines here in the image. This actually makes news. So, for example, there is an account in 1690 after a thorough investigation of masked armed robbers of the mail that a postboy is interrogated and identifies the thieves of the mail as the Viscount of Kingston's youngest son and the Laird of Geraldton's brother. So these are two people that are involved in a lot of chaos during the revolution in Haddington. And following this investigation, the council releases a proclamation that details that James and John Seaton, being highly disaffected to the regime and had threatened to kill the postboy of Cockgornspeth. In response, the monarch gets involved. King William desires that the Seatons be apprehended as soon as possible and did, quote, peremptorily prohibit and discharge all and sundry or lieges from robbing, reiving or stealing, stopping or intercepting of the ordinary packet, black box or by bag, whether by open force and violence or other ways, end quote. So Parliament then follows up on this incident afterwards with an act against the robbing of the packet, which I mentioned earlier. And the act specifies that for the interest of the quick and safe dispatch of letters and public orders from kingdom to kingdom or across the sea to Ireland, that, quote, the robbing or seizing of the common post, mail or packet or any other expresses is a notorious kind of robbery, end quote. And this is highly prejudicial to the government and commerce of the kingdom. Therefore, they declare the punishment for any of these activities as death and the confiscation of property. So to prevent any similar incidents, the council actually laid down really detailed instructions for the postmasters after this. And this is in November 1690. Because Haddington has had so many problems and so many packet bags and black boxes have been broken up, all postmasters are instructed to use distinctive seals. Therefore, if the packet arrived with a different or broken seal, the postmaster had instructions to interrogate the person who brought the packet along the postal route. Moreover, that the packet should never leave the postmaster's sight until they are dispatched to their destination, and any postmaster who failed to follow the directions would be removed from their office. Next slide, please. Okay, so one of the perks that emerges from monitoring the postal service is intercepted Jacobite correspondence. And there's a number of letters intercepted from Ireland into Scotland. One of the letters from David Nairn detailed that William's regime was going to be, quote, shortly to be overthrown, end quote. And Nairn also went on to say that he was very certain that there was many men in Scotland that would declare for James's cause. Another intercepted letter from George Middleton detailed that James had friends in Flanders and elsewhere who'd all been called to Ireland, and that he wished his relative Robert Middleton and Leith to take joy and comfort that he would see the glorious return of King James. The interruption of this network actually offered the Williamites an insight into the Jacobite campaign, but despite showing no real concrete information, the letters actually do indicate that James had a considerable force in Ireland and was making his way back to Scotland. This allowed the council to coordinate their campaigns in a more meaningful way, and intercepted letters could also shed light on Jacobites slipping through borders undetected. One particular letter from, I think, A. Kennedy to the Earl of Balcarres described his journey over to Ireland, in which, after being taken prisoner at Portpatrick, he managed to get to Carrickfergus safely without much trouble. So whether he escaped or didn't is unclear, but the letter does show that the infrastructure at the coast wasn't doing much to stop suspect persons travelling. Therefore, the council could then re-coordinate efforts at securing the coast better. The very ease of this crossing actually guaranteed frustration for both governments, as one could very possibly slip into the country unnoticed. So coordinating the post and intelligence reports from the events in Scotland and Ireland allows the administration to deal with the campaign more effectively, as the information all tends to be interrelated. So the collector, or the port packet operator, William Fullerton, was to transport and collect flying packets and dispatches from and for His Majesty's government, as well as monitor and control the traffic of people on the Irish Sea. The collector at Portpatrick is a really important person, and the packet boat itself is a very important communication route between Scotland and Ireland. And this is actually a precedent that was set in the 1640s. And as John mentioned, a lot of the things that are put into place dealing with the war in Ireland during the Revolution are actually from precedents already set. So Fullerton's records actually indicate that he is paid a sum of £529 for expresses by sea and by land, and £300 in expenses for establishing this packet boat at Portpatrick. And he's also awarded £60 extra for his diligence in creating a safe communication route, again emphasising how important these postal routes are in communication. He writes to the Privy Council in mid-July of 1691, reminding Crawford, who is then president of the council, that he is being put through a number of expenses protecting this postal route, and he is aware of its importance. So, next slide, please, sorry. So regardless of the risks of these communication networks, people at all levels have different opinions of the post, but no one questions its integrity to the campaign. Many Privy Councillors are concerned about interception, and this is really, really apparent in Hamilton and Melville's correspondence, which highlights the hazard of the post. Hamilton complains that he thinks his letters have been intercepted because he sent them in a black box which has never reached Scotland. And Melville responded that he's glad that Hamilton thought that the hazard from the Viscount of Dundee and the Irish wasn't that great, but he was troubled that he'd heard other things, and this emphasises that the postal networks were being tampered with. The Earl of Crawford later comments that during such a critical time, there was a great danger in keeping letters from friends and dispersing them among the enemies. So he urges the Secretary, George Melville, to use his power to secure these postal routes from people who are already, quote, crowning victory over us, end quote. Within the packet that Crawford has sent, he had included copies of letters from enemies of, quote, the church and state, end quote, and he hoped that Melville would use this to their advantage. Melville later also raises concerns about the postal service in July 1691, complaining that he had had no news from Scotland and that he was longing for news about Scotland, and cautioned that his letters were probably being broken up in the process. And he wanted John Dalrymple, the then Secretary of State, to inquire about this and make sure that these routes were secure. So the postal system ends up being this really vital arm for the Privy Council to coordinate the campaign. And because the new regime exercises very little real local power, the postal system serves to support the people who show zeal for the preservation of the new regime. The revolution had blurred these boundaries between the kingdoms, highlighting their independence, and it is clear from the Privy Council records that communication specifically by mail occupies a crucial place in the campaign, considering they were fighting a war on what they perceived as two fronts, the war in Ireland and the Highland War itself. So as the war continues and thoroughfare increases on the Irish Sea, the lines of communication become even more important. And the main reason the post is so important is because the postal employees are conveniently placed to do real damage to the regime, whether by covert or non-covert means. And as I mentioned earlier, packet boat operators could transport Jacobites into the kingdom. In short, the postal system could both help and harm the regime. Thank you.
Right, good. We're back on sound. Thanks very much, Gillian and John. Now, questions from the floor or the ether for either of them. Robin.
Can I just ask John, this isn't the most academic question, but was it the same Hugh Kennedy that was the moderator of the General Assembly in 1690 you were talking about?
No.
No.
Right.
Simple.
You did ask me. Sorry. Sorry for that. I really don't think so.
Alistair.
Gillian,
Yes.
you mentioned printing in relation to the postal service, and it wouldn't be a surprise to find that booksellers or book traders could also be handling post and vice versa. Now, William Mean, I called him Mean, I hope that's okay that you called it, so you pronounce it in a different way. William Mean could be related to James and John Mean. James, a bookseller of the 1680s, 1690s. John was a bookseller in about 1720s kind of period, I think. So, I mean, I don't know, but do you know anything more about William Mean in terms of his background?
I'm afraid to say I don't actually know anything more about his background. I would be interested to know if he's actually related to these printers and booksellers. And I'll have to go and investigate that, actually. Thanks for your question.
Okay.
Sorry, I can't be of more help.
No, that's okay, thank you.
Keith.
Yeah, hi Gillian, we haven't met, Keith Brown. So interesting, these two papers, they're both, if you like, about communication in one way or another. There's informal communication, which is what John's talking about, and communication stroke intelligence, and there's formal communication. And I guess, Gillian, what I'm interested in is you're describing a component part of a sort of infrastructure which is emerging around the way in which governments communicate, control communication, and all the rest of it. And I don't know what else sits within those categories. and how evolved it is, and it'd be just interesting to reflect on that. A royal messenger still being used, I don't know enough about this period. What's the role of justices of the peace, censorship, which Alistair's written about in the past? And if you put all that together, and the Post is clearly something we don't know very much about, it would be good to sort of get a sense of what does that do for or against the Privy Council in a more holistic sense. And then, John, you're kind of drawing the network theory and actor theory, which I know less about. But I mean, these are used by sociologists and anthropologists, and some of you may have studied that, I guess. And it can be about everything or about nothing. And that's the real hard bit about it, because if you take this collection of people in this room, it's a network with all people, as they call them, dyads, the connections between each of us. You have to put a value on what that connection is. So some of us have known one another for a very long time. That may mean something, or it may mean nothing. Some of us have met for the first time today. It might mean something, or it might mean nothing. And mapping that is, I tried to do it with some patronage networks back in the 2000s. The thing just grew and grew and grew and then kind of imploded. But there is actually quite sophisticated computer modelling that you can draw on for this, which is used in other disciplines. And if you were to sort of think about it as a methodology, and you were to take your Privy Councillors of the 1690s, the question would it be worth investing in that sort of modelling in order to figure out whether those informal networks add up to something that is something, or just add up to something that is nothing?
Gillian first.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, sure. So holistically, the control of the Post and communication during this period is probably part of the expansion of duties of the Privy Council. In all honesty, I've written a paper on how this does and published a recent article on how much this deals with the intelligence side of things in Parliaments, Estates and Representation. But the postal network, I don't know as much about as I do about the intelligence service, because the intelligence service itself runs through the Privy Council, and there are actually like specific records that deal with that. The Post Office has its expansion through the Treasury, I believe. So in terms of like whole Parliament trying to control communication and things like that, it's very difficult for them, because the postal service is becoming a much more public thing in this era, and is actually, they're running into more trouble trying to control information, especially with printing and things like that as well. I hope that answers your question.
Can I just add something to this,
Yeah.
if I may, before John answers? If you look at censorship, and actually, Robbie, false news as well, there is more activity in the Privy Council in the 1690s dealing with censorship, committees, etc., dealing with the problem of false news than there is under James beforehand. So there's definitely more authoritarianism as far as that's concerned after the revolution than there was under James II in Scotland, which is interesting in itself. So that would fit in with an agenda of controlling the message, controlling the media of the time, if you like. Like the classic coup, the dictator situation, where the first thing you do is get control of the TV station. Well, in this case, at the revolution, get control of the media and the postal service. Yeah.
Sorry, I've got one thing to add. They do a really good job of controlling the narrative that comes out of the Siege of Londonderry as well, which actually frustrates the Jacobite campaign quite a big, it's a big deal, because they're complaining about the narrative being so skewed towards a Williamite victory as well. So that also fits here.
Yeah, interesting.
Sure.
I have to be honest with you, Keith, like the network theory stuff I haven't really engaged with. So,
But it's the back of what you're saying.
yeah, no. What I was going to say is so a lot of the way I've kind of put that together is probably through a more kind of traditional pen and paper stuff, and maybe is the 1640s different because you've got those you've got session committees, you've got interval committees, parliaments meeting. So people, like say that, I don't think I did mention this, but like the guy, the George Porterfield who got the biscuit contract, and Hugh Kennedy who got the 11, 12 and 13 inch shoe size contract. Right. From the kind of manuscript stuff that Steve Murdoch gave me years ago, so this is to do with the Covenanters and European diplomacy and the English Parliament. So at Westminster, they're in a meeting with the Speaker of the House of Commons and some English parliamentarians, but the Scots, so these are diplomatic commissioners, so it's the diplomatic section of the Committee of Estates. And yeah, I'm not sure if Argyle's here, Warriston's there, but Porterfield is there and Kennedy's there. So they'd be together, well, they were together, you know, in the same room. You know, so whether, I'm not sure whether it's the experience of the 1640s would be different from that of the 1690s with that kind of particular approach. I'm not sure.
I think there's a problem, is there not, in establishing the quality of the networking. Certainly, I mean, just because you're a member of Parliament, for example, does not mean that you have a network relationship with every other member of Parliament, right? So there's a qualitative aspect to this. You need more evidence than one type of contact, for example. You need a build-up of them in order to establish a pattern. But I mean, that's what the nature of the game is, isn't it?
Yeah, I think with that particular, you're dealing with the West, you know, with that period of the Covenant. So like Hugh Kennedy, Ayr, Robert Barclay, Irvine, George Porterfield, Glasgow, you know, they're like Argyle's boys, if you. So is that an exception to the wider experience?
I get it. If it looks like a dog and it barks like a dog, it's a dog.
But remember, like what remember what I'm talking about here is Ireland, right? So this is about the Covenanters and military intervention in Ireland and the process and the parliamentarians, the parliamentary committees, and what the Privy Council is doing about Ireland. So is it surprising that it's Glasgow, Ayr, Irvine, etc., that are key aspects to that response?
I think it's important to say to our PhD students not to be put off establishing networks. Because a little bit of...
It's really difficult to do well.
But
I think historians, include myself in this, we tend to dabble in. Yes, I know, but there are theoretical constructs drawn from social sciences that we may or may not choose to use. And as historians, we tend to be quite suspicious of that approach.
Yeah.
And the question is whether or not for something like this, it might be worth just investing a little more time in. I guess that's all I'm saying. And I suppose the wider question, just to go back to something Julian and I have sort of debated in the past, is as you're moving through a period, a century, whatever, is there a shift from a relational basis of society to a institutional structuralist approach? Now, there are people today who would still say, oh, Boris Johnson and his government, it's all about people who met at Oxford, and they all know the people in the BBC, and that's how society is constructed, as against their institutions. And those institutions define the way in which decisions are made and policy is made and politics is driven. So it's about finding that balance in the 1690s and the Privy Council's sort of role in that. Is it the institution of the Privy Council that's giving those Privy Councillors a really important political role, or is it the networks they are bringing to the Privy Council and that they are deploying elsewhere in the country? That's an interesting question to deal with.
So we have someone's raised their hand, Alistair Briff. Alistair, if you want to turn on your mic and ask your question.
Hello everyone, I hope you can hear me. Maybe I'm just about to appear on your screen, I don't know. This is a question to Gillian, but I thought I might begin by answering Alistair's question of a wee while ago, which is about William Mean. He was the son of Robert Mean, who was the holder of the keeper, who was the keeper of the letter office in Edinburgh before him. So these are the people who have had that office since, I think, the 1660s. And it's just passed on from father to son. And I'm rather surprised, especially given what you were telling us, Gillian, about William's obvious sympathies with the previous regime, that he doesn't lose the position pretty quickly after the revolution, because, as you mentioned, Robert Blair is a new appointment because they wanted someone who was a Williamite to be Postmaster General. So that's who William Mean was. My question, though, relates to both of those men, because one of the things that these employees of the Postal Service did in this period was to write manuscript newsletters particularly for borough councils. And if you look in the borough council records, you see the contracts that are drawn up between particular keepers of letter office and the Postmaster General and the borough to supply news. And that's another reason why it's surprising that Mean kept his position, because I wondered, Gillian, if part of the concern, you concentrated very much on the interruption of the delivery of post, but is it also about these officers' capacity to shape the news by supplying potentially partial or false reports in their newsletters to borough councils and others who are buying those newsletters from them? Certainly, Edinburgh takes its news from Blair rather than from Mean. I think I'm just checking in something I've written on this from April 1690, presumably because Mean is either no longer in office by that point or he's supplying bad news. But is there a concern about these people's control over the transmission of newsletters?
Yeah, there really is a concern about their construction of the news itself as well, and that's why it's really surprising that he keeps his office. But the government really doesn't exercise as much local control over the offices as they would like to, because they're trying to stray away from this authoritarian nature of Parliament. So the Privy Council doesn't really intervene as much as it wants to, but it really clamps down on the regulation of these offices. So the details of how the postmaster does their job are really, it's really stringent, and they come before the council and they have to report to the council on certain things. They certainly do provide news to the boroughs, but as far as I'm aware, William Mean does keep his job, but that is very surprising to me.
Unfortunately, I don't think we've got very much evidence of these newsletters. I haven't found any myself, so I don't know if we know what they contain. Maybe they're just recycling stuff that came from London anyway, for the most part.
Possibly that's generally what they said anyway, but the contracts themselves between the post offices do actually exist. I have copies of them, at least from the Treasury records of where they place the post offices and what these contracts actually entail. There's specific ones from Ayr and Irvine that talk about Ireland and how they're going to keep communication between these places and not let Jacobite correspondence interrupt these networks of communication. And yes, I do focus on the interruption of it because they seem to place more emphasis on the fact that they want these networks to remain in place and they don't want Jacobites to be able to take them over, especially during wartime. As the period sort of moves into a more peaceful situation, I use peaceful in quotation marks, they tend not to focus much on the disruptions and more on how these postal networks are run. But specifically during the revolution, it's all about don't interrupt us or you're going to jail, basically.
Okay. And good maxim for the chair of any session. I think we better draw it to a close there because we've got to just after 5 and we are due to do our next session. But before we do that, I just invite everyone to thank both the speakers for 2 very interesting papers.